Welcome back once again. Today we are going to be concluding World War II, looking at its final chapters, both in the Pacific and in Europe, and then also talking a little bit about some of the overall results, or really more sort of setting the stage for how we will discuss those results in studies to come as we look at the conclusion of the war, but also how it begins to set up another fight, another kind of war, the Cold War, and how the groundwork for that is laid in these final months. And certainly in the final outcomes of World War II. So, the last place we left off, both in the European theater and also in the Pacific theater, I suppose we'll start with the European theater. We saw the very difficult, very costly, very ugly, but very successful in the end, Allied invasion of France on the beaches at Normandy, D-Day, which was incredibly costly and incredibly difficult and almost failed for the United States, but ultimately did succeed in securing those beachheads in Normandy and starting to push back the German advance that had been laid down so many years before, and starting to push Germans out of France, liberating Paris, and are moving ever closer towards Germany. So that's where we're going to pick up with that. And keep in mind that while British, American, French, and some Canadian troops are pushing German forces out of the territories that they had occupied, they're pushing German forces out of Western Europe. At the same time, the Soviets are on the other side, pushing German forces and their allies out of the Soviet Union and then pushing them further and further westward. So both sides eventually converging on Germany in the middle. And that's what's starting to happen as we move into 1944 or so. So, after the successful Allied invasion, the Allied forces continue to sweep across Europe. They do start to slow down, though, and start to lose some momentum as they cross into Germany itself. And that sets the stage for what will become the final German offensive of the war, the final time that Germany tries to launch an offensive and was almost kind of successful with it, is in what became known as the Battle of the Bulge. So again, this was the last time that Germans launched a counteroffensive, and it was called the Battle of the Bulge because it ended up creating this seeming bulge in the Allied lines as they pushed the Allied lines back significantly for a period of time. It was bitter, cold, ugly fighting. American and other Allied forces were about to get desperate when finally American planes were able to start dropping supplies in to give them more supplies, obviously, and start halting that German offensive. So eventually, Americans break through, weakening the German resources, and that pretty much leads them a path all the way through to the German interior. So this was kind of the last big major battle they had to fight. Not to say there wasn't more fighting, but this was kind of the last big hurdle they had to overcome. And they continue after the success, Allied success at the Battle of the Bulge, to sweep across Germany from the west, while Soviet soldiers are coming in from the east, eventually meeting in the middle. Now, there was a lot of contention here between the big three leaders. And again, this is where we start to see the fact that although Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union are all fighting on the same side at this particular point, they're very different, particularly the Soviet Union, and they had different goals and objectives for once this war was over with. And Churchill and Roosevelt knew that quite well, that their vision of what should happen once this was all over versus Stalin's vision of what should happen after this was all over was very, very different. So Churchill particularly really did not want the Soviet army to get to Berlin first. And if you look on your map, you will see that Berlin is in the sort of a northeast corner of Germany. So it was more likely that the Soviets were going to get to Berlin, which was the German capital first, and liberate the capital first, which would give them pretty much a lot of control over post-war Germany, which the United States and Britain ultimately didn't want. So they talked for a while about trying to speed things up and try to beat the Soviet army there, but ultimately decided that that would be too costly. So it is ultimately the Soviet Union that arrives in Berlin and lays siege to Berlin first, and will really spell true defeat for Germany. And we also start to see those soon to be tensions between these allies really start to emerge at what becomes one of the final conferences of the war. We looked at several of these, Casablanca and Tehran, but probably what is considered one of the more significant of these conferences of these big three leaders is the Yalta Conference, which was held in February of 1945. By the way, just to give you an idea about the timeline here, we are looking at just a few months before the end of the war. And that's what this picture is right here. This is Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin meeting at the Yalta Conference, which is in the Soviet Union. It was a sort of a resort town. And by this time, the defeat of Germany, the defeat of the Axis is pretty much imminent. So the main purpose of this was to discuss what happens when Germany surrenders, what is going to be the post-war plan, and how are we going to do things once Germany surrenders. And again, there were big differences between these three individuals, and mainly a big difference between what Roosevelt and Churchill foresaw and what Stalin wanted, and how they all kind of play their cards here. Because the United States, first of all, the United States, Roosevelt wants Stalin to come in and join the United States in fighting Japan. So that's something that he wants to get. So that's a card he's kind of playing. And Stalin knows that, so he's going to be kind of willing to give in to Stalin on some things because he wants Stalin's help in fighting Japan. But he also wants, the United States to take part in this post-world world. He does not want the United States to do what it did after World War I and return to isolationism. He wants to see a, engaged United States that recognizes international commitments and recognizes that it has responsibility in the world to be engaged and to be involved in all of those things. Churchill wants to make sure that all of France and Poland and all these places that had been occupied by Germany, that democracy is restored there, that they don't fall into chaos, they don't fall into dictatorships, and that all of this Nazism, totalitarianism, militarism, that all of those things are definitely defeated. Stalin sees things completely differently. You have to realize that the Soviet Union by this point has twice in recent memory been invaded by Germany, and so they want to make sure that that will never happen again. You must also remember that the Soviet Union, Stalin, by this point, they are a communist nation with completely different ideology than your Western democracies had about how things ought to look politically, economically, everything. And we also mustn't forget that Stalin himself is, a ruthless, murderous dictator. That's just the truth. And that was very different from Churchill and Roosevelt. And so there's just some very different ideologies here, and that's going to affect the decisions that they make. Some of the things that they did decide, this has actually already been decided. This was something that had been discussed at some of their previous meetings, and that was they started laying further plans to create what becomes the United Nations. Again, they had decided to do this, and this had been a goal of Roosevelt's since the United States got involved, really, was to create an international organization, much like the League of Nations. It's basically a revival of Wilson's idea about the League of Nations, but for it to be much stronger, for the United States to be involved in it this time, but pretty much acknowledging Wilson was onto something there and that they needed something like that in a post-war world. So this had already been agreed upon really before, but at the Yalta Conference, they sort of set aside a time actually to have another meeting where they're going to bring in more people to start laying the groundwork for what is to become the United Nations. So that's going to be a part of that post-war world as well. And they also, again, one of the big things that they were trying to do here was, lay plans for what happens when Germany surrenders. How are we going to administrate this? Who's going to be in charge? Which of us, if any of us, are going to be making the decisions while we rebuild Germany and they are able to rebuild their political structure and all of that. And ultimately what they decide to do is to divide former Nazi Germany, once they surrender, into occupation zones. And they will just divide it up into 4 specifically different territories. And each of the victorious nations will get a zone. So there's going to be a Soviet zone, which is going to be the part that includes Berlin mostly. The United States will have a zone, Britain will have a zone, and they also determine that one of the zones is going to be controlled by the French. So they will each control one of those zones for temporarily. It was all meant to be temporary until Germany was able to hold elections and get back on their feet and all of that. But, and if you know anything about the Cold War that's to come, that is the beginning of that split of Germany that's eventually going to happen. The idea originally being that this would be a temporary situation until it all kind of came back together. But as we will see, what Stalin implemented in his zone versus what your Western democracies implemented in their zones end up being completely different. So it is, once again, not only are they laying these important plans, laying this important groundwork and promising certain things, promising democratic elections. Stalin does do that, promising to have elections where the people that live in those areas can decide for themselves what kind of government they want, that we're going to show a commitment to democracy, to freedoms, to constitutions, all that kind of stuff. But a lot of that's not going to happen in the end. But it does show the big difference here, the big ideological difference between what the West, which would be the United States, Britain, France, all of that wanted versus what the Soviets wanted, and laying the groundwork for what was to come. So a lot of people point to the Yalta Conference as being kind of where the Cold War begins. And it's the last time that these three really meet together where it's still pretty amicable. Where they're still kind of working together pretty well. After this, it won't work so well. So the differences were really already there, but this is when we start to see those post-war visions really start to show more of a divide than a united front. So the war continues on. Again, the Soviets are able to enter, are surrounding and entering Berlin by April or so, or early April of 1945, and German defenses are collapsing. And eventually we see, of course, the collapse of Nazi Germany. Hitler himself, by this point, had barricaded himself inside a bunker in Berlin, along with several other higher-ranking Nazi officers. When the Soviet army is pretty much in Berlin, Hitler commits suicide, as well as some of his other higher ups do the same. Some of them flee, some are captured, but eventually the Soviet army liberates Berlin, and Germany surrenders to the Allies, and we call that VE Day, or what the United States would call that VE Day. VE standing for Victory in Europe, officially May 8th, 1945, when Germany surrendered to the Allies. And so the war in Germany over. But this celebration, as it was celebrated, of course, all over the United States, and people filling the streets to celebrate and going to churches to pray and church bells ringing, was also met with some sadness and some mourning, because unfortunately for Roosevelt, he didn't live to see this. Yalta was kind of one of the last major things that Roosevelt, certainly last major trip Roosevelt was able to make. He was already in very poor health by that time. The war had very much stressed him and been very taxing on his health. And so he actually, Roosevelt died of a brain hemorrhage in April of 1945. So he had died just a few weeks before Germany surrendered. So his vice president, Harry Truman, becomes the new president. And Truman had actually only been vice president for a very short amount of time, because he was not Roosevelt's vice president in his first 3 terms. He had only become the vice president in the 4th one, which had only just started a few weeks before this. So I think he'd been vice president something like 3 or 4 months when he becomes the president, and he will be president of the United States for the remainder of World War II. And he is got a lot of great qualities to him. He's very straightforward and honest, and kind of down home, kind of a way to talk and joke and things like that, which made him quite personable to a lot of people. But he also wasn't incredibly well known at the time, and he was no Roosevelt. I mean, Roosevelt was about as big as they could get. He'd been president for 12 years by that point. Roosevelt had a charm and just a sophistication to him, a charisma that Truman did not have. And so he's going to have quite the challenge, but he will lead the United States through the remainder of the war. Of course, as the Allies move through occupied German territory, starting when the Soviets start to recapture some of their own territory and continue to move through German occupied territory, one of the most shocking things that they saw was, of course, the results of what we now know of and what we now call the Holocaust. which I'm sure a lot of you have studied plenty of times and have learned lots about it in the past. So, this, of course, of all of the atrocities of the war, this one is probably considered to be the worst of all atrocities committed by Germany, committed by Japan, whoever. One of the greatest and most horrible crimes against humanity that may have ever been committed. We know that, for the Nazis, this anti-Jewish message, this anti Semitic message had been a part of Nazi ideology ever since the beginning, that Hitler and the Nazis were ruthless racists, obsessed with the idea of racial purity, obsessed with the idea of what they called the Aryan race, this superior Anglo-Saxon Germanic race, that they were somehow racially superior and better than anyone else. And so that ultimately leads the Nazis to not just build that into their ideology and build that into their rhetoric, but to eventually start developing policies, which they actually started implementing those policies well before the war began, to deal with what they saw as the Jewish problem. And one of the ways that Hitler had gained power was by blaming the Jewish population on German, for so many of Germany's problems, blaming them for the economic trouble after World War I, blaming them for the defeat in World War I, scapegoating them is the word for that. And so ever since, the Nazis came to power, they had begun to make life incredibly difficult and target the Jewish people, as well as other ethnic minorities and other undesirable groups as they saw them. And ultimately, that leads to sometime during the war, the Nazis coming up with what they called their final solution to the Jewish problem, which, of course, was the planned, calculated, well laid out plan to eliminate the Jewish population by murdering them, by committing mass murder, by building camps that were designed for the sole purpose to kill as many people as they could, to eradicate them, to commit genocide is what this was, of course. Again, it is based on this idea of anti-Semitism that was well ingrained in Nazi ideology from the beginning. Anti-Semitism, or if someone is anti-Semitic, that is discrimination, hostility, often violent, ugly hatred toward Jewish people. Again, there had been so many hardships during and after World War I that a lot of people wanted somebody to blame, and the Nazis easily found that scapegoat and found that someone in the Jewish population, mixing that with this obsession with racial purity, and that became just the official policy of Nazi Germany. Was this anti-Semitic idea running all the way through it? And that started in the 1930s with boycotts of Jewish businesses and just anti-Jewish propaganda, eventually taking away citizenship from Jewish people, portraying them as enemies of Germany, passing racial laws that made it illegal for a Jewish person to marry a non-Jewish person, so forth and so on. Jewish people were stripped of their property. They were stripped of their businesses. Eventually, as you know, forced to identify themselves by wearing, patches or a Star of David on their clothing, to identify the fact that they were Jewish, so that they would be treated differently. And then eventually they start, and certainly as they start taking over places like Poland, they would start to seclude Jewish people into certain parts of cities. They would block off, a couple of parts of cities and create ghettos. Where they had people crowded in, these areas with poor sanitation and little food. People are starving to death. And they sort of just kept them there until they could figure out what to do with them. And when they finally come up with this final solution plan to kill them in these death camps, then they start deporting Jews from, as well as other socially undesirables, whether they were ethnic minorities, gypsies, homosexuals, people that were mentally disabled or intellectually disabled, communists, socialists, but the vast majority, of course, being Jews, being sent off to these death camps like Auschwitz and Dachau and Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald and all of those places that existed for the primary purpose of mass murder, being told that they're going to work camps, and many of them were used as forced laborers. Many of them killed upon arrival, most of them, particularly if they were older, if they were young, babies, children, seen as weak, they would be taken to gas chambers. The Germans developed the use of gas chambers using a pesticide, Zyklon B, telling the prisoners that they were going to be showered or deloused, and they would put them in those chambers and kill hundreds at a time, and then cremate the bodies or dump them into mass graves. Those who weren't killed upon arrival, were in crowded barracks, eating, rotten soup maybe once a day, in terribly unsanitary conditions. And of course, it was just absolutely horrendous. And when the Soviets start liberating these camps, Americans, British start seeing all of this, they're just overwhelmed by it. There was, the question is always, how much did the Allies know? There were certainly reports of it, and there were certainly, we knew that Jewish people were being unfairly treated and that they were being targeted. As far as how bad it was, the extent of it, no, I don't think anyone knew that until they saw it. But there was definitely inclination that something was going on, and there was definitely certainly more that the Allies could have done, either to find out more. Like, if they didn't know, there's a lot of things they could have done to find out. But nevertheless, in the end, about 6 million Jews, and probably about 1 million additional non-Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. That is about 2/3 of all European Jews. In some European cities, in some European areas, that would have been larger percentages than others. For example, in Poland, which I believe had it the worst, I think about 90%, which is virtually all of their Jewish population, was murdered in the Holocaust. So this was certainly one of the things that causes World War II to really redefine war itself and create this notion internationally that there are some things that are always wrong. It doesn't matter if it's war. It doesn't matter if it's following orders. It doesn't matter what it's for, that there are certain things, the whole term crimes against humanity, comes from that. And this idea that there are some things that will always be unacceptable, and that cannot be allowed to happen ever again. And it's one of those things where the United States, perhaps in particular, confronts that after the war. We have a moral obligation. We can't just, pretend like we're not a part of this. We can't just pretend like we didn't contribute to this in some kind of a way, and that we don't have a moral obligation to be more involved and to stand up for people that can't stand up for themselves, and to be a voice for reason and to be a voice for the oppressed, and those kinds of things. So it changes a lot of things, a lot of way the world sees different things, but still a lot of questions surrounding the Holocaust. Now let's take a look back at the Pacific. The last thing we left there was the recapture of the Philippines, and the United States having the upper hand now as it comes to and getting closer and closer to the Japanese mainland. So by 1944 is about where we are, early 1944. The United States is inching closer to the Japanese mainland. But as the United States gets closer and closer to the Japanese mainland, the fighting gets more and more fierce. Remember what we said last time is that the Japanese defenders were the type that just culturally that would defend to the last man. They would not surrender. These were people that were more than willing to sacrifice themselves and would have launched 1,000, bloody, sacrificial, suicidal assaults before they ever would have surrendered. And so it gets quite bloody. The last two major islands that the United States had to capture to prepare for the invasion of Japan were Iwo Jima and Okinawa. You probably have heard of these. Iwo Jima is where, and I didn't include it here, but the famous photograph of the soldiers lifting the flag, that becomes the Marine Memorial in Washington, that comes from Iwo Jima. The 5, and then Okinawa was next, a campaign from April to June of 1945. Both of these incredibly ugly, incredibly hard fought, took months to secure both of these islands. And but the last obstacles that were needed in order to invade Japan. Okinawa becomes the costliest of all battles, one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific, huge undertaking, surpassed only by D-Day. So these were, again, where the fighting got absolutely brutal. Thousands of kamikaze strikes, again, the Japanese willing to fight to the death rather than surrender. But ultimately, by June of 1945, the United States has secured both Iwo Jima and Okinawa and is ready to start planning the invasion of Japan. So everything is being set. They needed Okinawa as a sort of a staging area for the invasion of Japan. But as you may know, that invasion of Japan ends up not happening, and the war ends a little bit different. Because during the war, actually, even before the United States got in the war, a project had been going on called the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was initiated actually in 1939, well before the United States entered the war. It was initiated by President Roosevelt, and this was, of course, the secret government project to build the atomic bomb, to build a bomb that could split an atom, thus releasing destructive force, unlike anything anyone had ever seen, nuclear weapons. And this had been initiated after Roosevelt, actually after the suggestion by, of course, famous physicist Albert Einstein, who had defected from Germany when things started to get ugly there, suggested that the Germans were trying to do the same thing and said, I know that they're trying to do this, and this is what it would mean. This would be incredibly destructive. And so as a means to develop such a weapon before the Germans could, and originally meant to be used against Germany if it were developed, this project had been being worked on in secret at various places in the United States, all of it so secret that different parts of it were being worked on at different facilities so that no one person really knew too much about it. This was one of the things that President Truman was briefed upon his being sworn in, that he had no idea about until then, because it was so secret. Just Roosevelt and a few other people knew about it. In the end, obviously, the result of the Manhattan Project will not be used against Germany because it wasn't ready yet. Once Germany was invaded, they found through papers that the project had actually been abandoned a good while before Germany fell. But the weapon is tested in July of 1945 successfully. And when President Truman is informed of that successful test, he always said there was never a question about whether or not the United States should use this weapon. Because an invasion, for one thing, different analysts had projected that an invasion could cost 250,000 American lives, millions more Japanese lives, whereas a weapon like the atomic bomb would bring about a quick and decisive end to the war without such an invasion. There was also the argument that using a weapon like this would end the war before the Soviet Union really got involved in it. That was something that was needed. But if you end it without them, then you don't have to share the peace with them. You don't have to argue with the Soviet Union and share in whatever post-war whatever happens in Japan. You don't have to share that with the Soviet Union. And also, this is when, of course, the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union is really starting to show. And it was argued that if you use this weapon, not only will it end the war before the Soviet Union has to be involved, but it also demonstrates military superiority to the Soviet Union, and kind of gives the United States the upper hand now there. Again, for Truman, he would always argue there was never a question. It was about saving American lives. They, of course, knew that this would bring about catastrophic destruction and kill thousands of Japanese civilians, but decided that ultimately that was worth the sacrifice. And also, by this point, the killing of civilians had just kind of become accepted as part of the war, not to rationalize it, not to make excuses for it, but that was part of the thinking of a lot of military analysts. Before this, Japan had been being bombed, and there was all kind of things going on to try to soften up their defenses before an invasion could happen, to try to break the will of the people. Japan's being encouraged to surrender, but of course they will not. And so Truman authorizes the use of the atomic bomb first on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, and it was dropped on the city of Hiroshima August 6, 1945. Hiroshima was a industrial center, like their ships and so forth. A lot of their naval vessels were built there, and it was somewhat of a large city, a population of probably about 400,000 people. The bomb is dropped, and it detonates, destroying about 90% of the city. killing maybe about 80,000 people, women, children. A lot of them, it's really hard to say because so many of them would have just been vaporized. I mean, there wouldn't have been any sort of remains to count. So it's hard to say exactly how many people it kills. Within a few months, the death toll was probably up to about 140,000 because there would be others that would die later of radiation poisoning and radiation related sicknesses. And then even decades later, there were still people dying of cancer and things that were caused by that. Even after the devastation at Hiroshima, Japan still refused to surrender. The United States, very frustrated with that, made the decision to drop the second and actually the only other atomic bomb the United States had on the Japanese city of Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945, just a few days later. Nagasaki was another target similar to Hiroshima in that it was a shipbuilding center. This one also does similar damage, destroying most of the city, killing killing thousands more Japanese civilians. And it is with that that Japan frantically surrenders, and that brings about VJ Day, Victory in Japan Day. August 15th, 1945 is when the terms of the surrender were accepted. Sometimes you might see September 2nd as the day because that's the day it was kind of recognized and celebrated in the United States. But with the dropping of the atomic bombs, Japan surrenders and World War II ended, was over in an American victory. I don't have my transitions in, so I'll just go through these things bit by bit. So in the end, with the war over, World War II changes everything. It brings about an entirely new American age, an entirely new world order in a lot of ways, in that not only this, of course, was the largest and costliest event in human history. You've heard some of the numbers probably already of between 50 and 60 million people dead, about 2/3 of those civilians. But the United States bore a small portion of that in comparison, not to downplay it or to say that it wasn't terrible. But the United States is probably less than 300,000 dead. Isn't very much when you compare that to 30 million in the Soviet Union and nearly 6 million in Germany and 10 million in China. I mean, it's just mind-boggling. Again, war itself redefined because of this. And not only did the United States have a smaller number killed and a smaller number wounded, as terrible as that was, the fighting didn't take place on the American mainland. The United States was not having to deal with destroyed cities and whole communities that had been leveled and all of that. So the United States, was in a very, very powerful position at the end of this conflict. So it does bring about a so-called New World Order, as you might call it. Before this, colonial empires kind of dominated the world, and world affairs, world decisions tended to be made in European capitals. It was about what Britain and France kind of ruled the world and had really since the 18th century. I mean, that wasn't something that was new, but this really changes that, and that those countries, it's not like they're gone anywhere. It's not like they're not important, but far less. I don't want to say relevant, but far less. As strategically important, maybe not just not really calling the shots as much as they used to. Things like Nazism and fascism and Japanese militarism are defeated as a result. And whereas those colonial powers and European powers are no longer the big powers of the world, the United States finds itself in that position. The United States finds itself as what some might call the leader of the free world, the most powerful country on earth, a superpower with nuclear capability, a incredibly strong economy, producing about half of the world's manufactured goods, unprecedented and unrivaled military power. It definitely was, like I said, an absolute new age. It transforms American life in so many ways, as far as the economy, looking at economic changes here. It brings about an end to the Great Depression forever, doing away with that unemployment problem that had ravaged the United States and the world for so long. And it paves the way for an unprecedented economic prosperity that we'll see throughout the 1950s. We see the birth of giant corporations. We'd seen big business before, but not like the giant corporations we'll see of the latter 20th century moving into the 21st century, a product of the government contracts with industry that we saw during the war. New technologies, radar, computers, plastics, synthetics, all of those things that were developed for the military, aircraft, air travel, all that developed for the military, but then has an impact on consumer life and have a role in the private sector once the war is over with. American position in the world, again, as I mentioned, the United States emerges from this as arguably the most powerful country on earth. And no longer the whole isolationist sentiment that we saw after World War I, that the United States needed to stay out and be neutral and avoid confrontations and avoid taking sides, that pretty much evaporated. And the United States began to accept and emerge a new global and a new political and military position with political and military responsibilities, and expanded economic interests in the world. So it's a much more involved United States, engaged internationalism as opposed to isolationism. However, that same position or a very similar position is something that the Soviet Union finds himself in as well. So whereas the United States emerges incredibly powerful, so does the Soviet Union, despite their huge losses of human life and economic devastation. They have new territory, enhanced influence, and also the greatest power in Europe and Asia. If the United States is the greatest power in the West, the Soviet Union was definitely that counterpart in the East. And so we are setting the stage for decades of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union that we'll be talking about soon, and of course what becomes known as the Cold War.